What happens when a civilization begins teaching its children that moral values are nothing more than personal feelings? That words like good and bad do not describe anything real about the world, but only our emotional reactions to it. According to C.S. Lewis, this idea may seem harmless at first, but if it becomes widely accepted, its consequences may reach far beyond philosophy classrooms. In fact, Lewis believed that this seemingly small shift in thinking could eventually undermine the very foundations of civilization. His warning appears in one of the most remarkable short philosophical works of the 20th century, The Abolition of Man. Lewis begins with a simple example. He examines a school textbook used to teach English literature. In it, the authors analyze a famous description of a waterfall. A traveler looks at the waterfall and calls it sublime. At first glance, this seems like a normal aesthetic judgment, but the textbook authors interpret the statement differently. They tell students that when someone says a waterfall is sublime, they are not really describing the waterfall. They are only describing their own feelings about it. In other words, the waterfall itself is not sublime. The speaker is simply expressing an emotion. At first, this may sound like a harmless clarification, but Lewis believed something much deeper was happening. Because if statements about beauty are only expressions of feeling, then statements about goodness may also become nothing more than expressions of feeling. And if that is true, then the entire language of morality begins to change. Lewis insists that when we call something beautiful, or noble, or good, we are not merely reporting our internal emotions. We are making a claim about reality. Remember that in the videos on After Virtue, Alistair McIntyre describes this same idea as emotivism. Like C.S. Lewis, he criticizes it for reducing moral judgments to expressions of feeling rather than claims about reality. We are saying that certain things genuinely deserve admiration, that some actions are truly worthy, and that certain responses are appropriate to the world. For Lewis, this distinction matters enormously, because education is not just about transmitting information. It is about shaping the moral imagination, teaching people to respond rightly to reality. If students are taught that value judgments are merely subjective feelings, they may gradually lose the ability to recognize genuine value at all. Lewis describes the result with one of the most memorable phrases in the book. He says modern education risks producing men without chests. In Lewis's metaphor, the human person has three parts: the head, our rational intellect; the belly, our appetites and impulses; and between them, the chest. The chest represents trained moral sentiment, the cultivated ability to love what is good and hate what is evil. In earlier civilizations, education aimed to develop this moral center. But if students are taught that moral judgments are merely subjective, the chest is gradually removed. Reason remains, appetite remains, but the bridge between them disappears. And Lewis observes something deeply ironic. Modern educators often complain that people lack virtue, but at the same time, the educational system itself may be quietly dismantling the very foundation that produces it. As Lewis famously writes, "We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise." The deeper problem Lewis identifies is philosophical. If all value judgments are subjective, then moral statements cannot really be true or false. They become expressions of preference. Statements like "murder is wrong" or "justice matters" would mean nothing more than "I dislike murder" or "I prefer justice." But if moral language works this way, then arguments about morality become strangely empty. Disagreements cannot really be resolved, because there is no shared reality to appeal to. And yet Lewis observes something interesting. Even the philosophers who claim morality is subjective rarely live as though it truly is. They still expect honesty. They still condemn cruelty. They still appeal to fairness. In practice, even moral skeptics behave as if some values are genuinely real. In the second part of the book, Lewis introduces one of his most important ideas. Across different civilizations and historical periods, people have recognized remarkably similar moral principles: respect for parents, condemnation of betrayal, admiration for courage, concern for justice. Lewis calls this shared moral inheritance the Tao. The Tao is not a single religious doctrine. It is the underlying moral framework recognized across cultures. Ancient Greece, classical China, medieval Europe, traditional Africa, different civilizations express these principles in different ways, but the core ideas repeatedly appear. For Lewis, this pattern suggests something important. Moral values may not simply be cultural inventions. They may reflect something real about human nature and reality itself. Lewis warns that modern thinkers sometimes imagine they can step outside this moral framework. They believe they can discard traditional moral principles and replace them with a new, rational system of values. But Lewis argues this is an illusion, because any attempt to construct a new moral system must still rely on some values, some reasons for why certain things are better than others. And those reasons inevitably draw upon the very moral tradition they claim to reject. In other words, you cannot overthrow the Tao without secretly depending on it. Lewis's argument in the first lecture is subtle but powerful. If a civilization teaches that values are merely subjective feelings, it risks producing people who no longer recognize objective moral truths. The result may not be greater freedom, it may be confusion, because reason alone cannot tell us what is worth pursuing, and appetite alone cannot guide a civilization. What holds them together is the cultivated moral vision that Lewis calls the chest. And in the next lecture, Lewis will make an even more provocative claim. He will argue that when humanity abandons objective value, it does not simply change morality, it changes what it means to be human. And that is where the title of the book begins to reveal its full meaning: the abolition of man. I'll see you in the next episode.